On April 4th, 2022, we arrived at the campsite nestled deep within the forest. The tall trees towered over us, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting long shadows on the ground. As we set up our tents, the peaceful surroundings seemed to hold a hidden secret. That first night, as the campfire crackled and we shared stories, an eerie silence settled around us. It was as if the forest itself was listening. Later that night, as we lay in our tents, strange noises began to echo through the woods. Soft whispers, almost indistinguishable, seemed to surround us. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the sounds grew closer. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friends also lay awake, their eyes wide with fear. The noises persisted, making it nearly impossible to sleep. The next morning, we discovered eerie carvings on the trees surrounding our campsite. The symbols were unfamiliar and unsettling, etched deep into the bark. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us silently wondering who or what had created them. Despite our growing apprehension, we decided to explore the area further, hoping to uncover the source of the disturbances. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The structure was decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. We found an old journal on a rickety table, its pages filled with cryptic entries. The words hinted at a dark presence lurking in the forest, watching and waiting. That night, the sense of being watched intensified. Shadows flickered at the edge of our vision, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. Sleep was impossible as the feeling of dread settled over us like a heavy blanket. We knew we had to leave, but an invisible force seemed to be holding us back, making escape feel impossible. As the sun rose, we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the eerie campsite. The carvings on the trees seemed more menacing in the daylight, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on us. With a shared sense of urgency, we set off in the direction we thought would lead us back to civilization. But the forest seemed to have other plans. We hadn't gone far when we discovered an old, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. The structure looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and decayed. We approached cautiously, the air thick with anticipation. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule of forgotten lives. Dust-covered furniture, rotting books, and a sense of lingering despair greeted us. In the corner, we found an old journal, its pages filled with cryptic entries about a dark presence in the woods. Reading the journal, we learned of previous campers who had encountered the same eerie phenomena we were experiencing. They wrote of whispers, shadows, and the feeling of being watched. The entries grew increasingly frantic, detailing disappearances and a sense of impending doom. The final entry was smeared with what looked like blood, ending abruptly. Fear gnawed at us as we realized we might be facing the same fate. As we left the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around us. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and shadows flickered at the edge of our vision. Each step felt like a struggle against an invisible force trying to pull us back. We moved as quickly as we could, but it felt like we were making no progress. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and panic started to set in. That night, as we huddled around a small fire, the oppressive atmosphere became unbearable. We could hear footsteps circling our campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see what was out there. Suddenly, one of our group screamed, pointing into the darkness. A pair of
Music
glowing eyes
licensing
stared back at us
reimagined.
before vanishing into the night. In a frenzy, we decided to leave immediately, abandoning our tents and supplies. But as we tried to find our way back, the forest seemed to shift and change, confusing our sense of direction. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, and we felt an invisible presence closing in. Desperation clawed at us as we realized we were trapped, unable to escape the silent woods. The following morning, exhaustion and fear were etched on all our faces. We had spent the night huddled together, eyes wide open, listening to the sinister sounds of the forest. As daylight
Music
broke, we
licensing
regrouped
reimagined.
and decided to search for our missing friend. The forest felt more sinister in the light of day, and every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. We searched tirelessly, calling out for our friend, but there was no response. As we ventured deeper, we stumbled upon more of those eerie carvings on trees, each one more elaborate and disturbing than the last. It felt like the forest was mocking us, showing us how deeply it was intertwined with the darkness we couldn't comprehend. My heart sank as we found a piece of clothing that belonged to our friend, torn and dirty, hanging from a branch. The fear and paranoia grew stronger within our group. We began to question every sound, every shadow, suspecting that something or someone was watching our every move. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. The forest seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that fed off our fear. As night approached, we found ourselves back at the old abandoned cabin. This time, we noticed new symbols etched into its walls, symbols that hadn't been there before. Inside, the air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. We found another entry in the journal, one that hadn't been there before, detailing our own arrival and the horrors we had yet to face. It felt as though the cabin itself was a living entity, recording our every move. In a moment of panic, one of our friends decided to stay behind, believing that the cabin might hold the key to escaping the forest's grip. Despite our pleas, they insisted, driven by a desperate hope. As we left the cabin, their figure became a shadowy silhouette against the encroaching darkness. The rest of us continued our futile attempt to find a way out, the whispers now replaced by haunting screams that echoed through the night. The next day, the forest felt even more sinister, if that was possible. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Exhausted and terrified, we pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to escape. The forest seemed to have a mind of its own, confusing us with paths that led nowhere. As we trudged through the woods, strange symbols began to appear around our makeshift campsites. These symbols were carved into trees, rocks, and even the ground, their intricate designs pulsing with an otherworldly energy. It felt like the forest was marking us, claiming us as its own. The sense of dread grew heavier, making it hard to breathe. We realized with growing horror that personal items were going missing. First, it was small things, flashlights, water bottles. But soon, more significant items began to disappear. A sense of paranoia settled over us, and we started to suspect each other. The forest whispers seemed to taunt us, feeding our fears and distrust. One night, another member of our group vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a chilling silence. We decided to leave the campsite, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. But as we tried to navigate the forest, We found ourselves going in
Music
circles.
licensing reimagined.
Every path we took seemed to lead us back to the same spot. It was as if the forest itself was playing a cruel game with us, trapping us in its endless maze. The realization that we were hopelessly lost hit us like a cold wave, and despair began to take hold. As night fell, the whispers grew louder and more insistent, filling our minds with an overwhelming sense of doom.
Artlist
Shadows flitted at the edge of our vision, and unseen eyes seemed to follow our every move. The forest was alive with a malevolent presence that fed off our fear. Desperation clawed at us as we tried to find a way out, but every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into the heart of darkness. The next day, the forest felt even more sinister, if that was possible. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Exhausted and terrified, we pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to escape.
Music licensing
The forest seemed to have a
reimagined.
mind of its own, confusing us with paths that led nowhere. As we trudged through the woods, strange symbols began to appear around our makeshift campsites. These symbols were carved into trees, rocks, and even the ground, their intricate designs pulsing with an otherworldly energy. It felt like the forest was marking us, claiming us as its own.
Artlist.io.
The sense of dread grew heavier, making it hard to breathe. We realized with growing horror that personal items were going missing. First, it was small things, flashlights, water bottles, but soon, more significant items began to disappear.
Music licensing
A sense of
reimagined.
paranoia settled over us, and we started to suspect each other. The forest's whispers seemed to taunt us, feeding our fears and distrust. One night, another member of our group vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a chilling silence. We decided to leave the campsite, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. But as we tried to navigate the forest, we found
Artlist.io.
ourselves going in circles. Every path we took seemed to lead us back to the same spot. It was as if the forest itself was playing a cruel game with us, trapping us in its endless maze. The realization that we were hopelessly lost hit us like a cold wave, and despair began to take hold. As night fell, the whispers grew louder
Artlist.io.
and more insistent, filling our minds with an overwhelming sense of doom. Shadows flitted at the edge of our vision, and unseen eyes seemed to follow our every move. The forest was alive with a malevolent presence that fed off our fear. Desperation
licensing
clawed at us as we
reimagined.
tried to find a way out, but every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into the heart of darkness. As the final night descended, the air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant, haunting cries of unseen creatures. We huddled together, our flashlights flickering weakly, casting feeble beams of light that did little to pierce the darkness. Every sound,
Artlist.io.
every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. We knew we were being hunted by something beyond our understanding. Suddenly, the forest came alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, their shapes indistinct yet menacing. We could feel the
Music
presence
licensing
closing in on us,
reimagined.
an overwhelming sense of malevolence that sent chills down our spines. Panic surged through us, and in a desperate bid for survival, we bolted in different directions, hoping to confuse whatever was stalking us. As I ran, branches clawed at my skin, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I could hear the terrified screams of my friends echoing through the woods,
Artlist.io.
growing fainter with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled upon a clearing and froze, my blood turning to ice. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient gnarled tree, its roots twisted and exposed, forming a grotesque shape. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt an unseen force drawing me towards the tree. I tried to resist, but my legs moved of their own accord. As I approached, I saw the faces of my missing friends etched into the bark, their eyes wide with terror. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The forest had claimed them, and it was coming for me next. Desperation clawed at my mind as I fought to break free from the tree's sinister pull. With a final frantic effort, I managed to tear myself away and stumbled back into the forest. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, until I finally burst out of the woods and into the open air. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the landscape, but the warmth did nothing to dispel the cold fear that gripped my heart. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the horrors I had witnessed. I was the only one who made it out, but the forest had left its mark on me.
Reimagined.
I could still hear the whispers, still feel the eyes watching me. The silent woods had taken everything from me, and I knew I could never escape its grasp entirely. As I stumbled back to civilization, I vowed to warn others of the darkness that lurked within those trees, hoping against hope that my tale would prevent others from sharing my fate. We arrived at the campsite on August 6th, 2023, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The sun was shining, and the forest around us was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. We set up our tents in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, feeling a sense of peace and excitement. Little did we know that our perfect camping spot held a dark secret. While exploring the area, we stumbled upon an overgrown trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The path was barely visible, covered in moss and underbrush, as if it hadn't been used in years. Despite a growing sense of unease, we decided to follow the trail, curiosity getting the better of us. As we walked, we noticed old, rusted signs warning travelers to turn back. The further we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sunlight. Strange occurrences began almost immediately. Flickering lights danced at the edge of our vision, and odd sounds echoed through the woods. Footsteps, whispers, and the occasional snap of a twig. We tried to brush it off, but an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. As night fell, we made camp along the forgotten path, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, the usual nighttime sounds conspicuously absent. We shared uneasy glances, each of us feeling the oppressive silence. The flickering lights returned, dancing among the trees, and we could hear soft, disembodied voices calling our names. Sleep was elusive as we lay awake, listening to the unsettling noises. In the morning, we discovered a hidden, dilapidated shack further down the trail. It was as if the forest had been hiding it from us. The structure was barely standing, its wooden walls rotting and covered in vines. Inside, we found disturbing remnants of previous visitors, tattered clothing, rusted tools, and old photographs. The shack felt wrong, as if it held the memories of countless tragedies. We decided to leave, but the path that had led us here seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the forest. As we tried to retrace our steps, the forest seemed to shift around us, obscuring the trail we had followed. The dense underbrush and towering trees formed an almost impenetrable wall. Panic started to set in as we realized we were lost. The sense of unease from the previous night grew stronger, gnawing at our nerves. It felt like the forest was alive, watching our every move. The strange occurrences intensified as the day wore on. The whispers became more persistent, and the flickering lights seemed to follow us. Shadows darted between the trees, just out of sight, making our hearts race. We found ourselves drawn back to the dilapidated shack, as if an unseen force was guiding us. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. Inside the shack, we discovered more disturbing evidence of past visitors. Old, weathered journals filled with desperate entries about losing the trail and being watched by unseen eyes. The writing spoke of a malevolent presence that toyed with their minds, leading them deeper into the forest's clutches. Fear gnawed at us as we read their accounts, realizing that we might be facing the same fate. Night fell once again, and the oppressive darkness seemed to come alive with movement. The disembodied voices grew louder, calling our names with an eerie familiarity. One of our group, Sarah, claimed she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. We all turned, but there was nothing there. The forest was playing tricks on us, feeding our paranoia and fear. In the middle of the night, we were jolted awake by the sound of a scream. One of our friends, Alex, was gone, his sleeping bag empty. We frantically searched the area, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of him. The whispers and footsteps grew louder, closing in on us. We huddled together, terrified, knowing that something out there was hunting us. The forest had taken another victim, and we were powerless to stop it. As dawn broke, we were exhausted and terrified, our minds reeling from the night's events. Alex's disappearance weighed heavily on us, and we knew we had to find him. The forest seemed more oppressive in the daylight, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. We called out for Alex, our voices echoing through the dense foliage, but there was no response. The unease grew as we discovered strange symbols etched into the trees and rocks around us. They were intricate and disturbing, unlike anything we had ever seen before. It felt as though the forest itself was mocking us, showing us that we were trapped in its web. As we pressed on, we found a trail of footprints that seemed to belong to Alex, leading deeper into the woods. Following the footprints, we encountered a shadowy figure at a distance. It stood motionless, watching us with an unnerving intensity. We called out, hoping it was Alex, but the figure vanished into the trees without a sound. The encounter left us shaken, our fear escalating with each passing moment. It was clear that we were not alone, and whatever was out there was playing a cruel game with us. As night fell once again, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent, filling our minds with dread. We set up a makeshift camp, our nerves frayed and our bodies exhausted. The shadows seemed to dance at the edge of our vision, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Sleep was impossible as we listened to the forest come alive with unseen horrors. Suddenly, one of our group, Mark, went missing. We had been sitting around the campfire trying to stay calm when he simply vanished without a trace. Panic set in as we searched the area, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The forest seemed to swallow our voices, absorbing them into the darkness. The realization that we were being picked off one by one was a chilling thought. and we knew we had to escape before it was too late. The next morning, the forest felt like an endless labyrinth. Every direction seemed the same, each path winding deeper into the unknown. Our fear and desperation grew with each passing hour. We stumbled upon a cluster of rocks with more of those strange symbols carved into them. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. As we searched for any sign of Alex and Mark, we found a diary tucked into a crevice between the rocks. The entries were from years ago, written by someone who had also lost their way in these woods. The descriptions were eerily similar to our own experiences: whispers, shadows, and disappearances. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, ending abruptly. The realization that others had been trapped here and never found a way out filled us with dread. Night came swiftly, the darkness engulfing us. We lit a small fire, hoping it would keep the unseen horrors at bay. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent, surrounding us. We heard our names being called out from the darkness, mimicking the voices of our missing friends. The forest was toying with us, and the fear was becoming unbearable. As we huddled together, trying to stay awake, we felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The realization that the path we had taken had disappeared hit us like a wave. It was as if the forest itself was shifting and changing, preventing us from finding our way back. The symbols carved into the trees and rocks seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, adding to the surreal, nightmarish atmosphere. Suddenly, we saw movement in the shadows. A figure stepped into the firelight, and for a moment, we thought it was one of our missing friends. But as it came closer, we saw that it was a grotesque, twisted version of Mark. His eyes were vacant, and his movements were jerky, as if he was being controlled by an unseen force. We screamed and backed away, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The forest had shown us its true power, and we knew we were running out of time. The final night was the most terrifying of all. The forest had fully come alive, an entity unto itself, and it felt like we were at its mercy. The whispers now turned into a cacophony of voices, each one more insistent and menacing than the last. Shadows moved closer, almost within arm's reach, and the air grew colder with every passing minute. In our last desperate attempt to escape, we decided to make a run for it. We packed what little we had left and chose a direction at random, hoping against hope that it would lead us out. The forest seemed to resist our every step, branches reaching out to snag our clothes, roots tripping us up. The darkness was so thick it felt like a physical presence, pressing in on us from all sides. As we ran, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us, but when we turned, there was nothing there. Our minds were unraveling under the relentless pressure. Panic set in as we realized we were going in circles, every landmark looking eerily familiar. The forest was playing with us, ensuring that escape was impossible. In a final, harrowing confrontation, the malevolent force that had been stalking us revealed itself. It took the form of our missing friends, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and torment. They reached out to us, their eyes pleading for help. But when we tried to touch them, they dissolved into shadows, leaving us clutching at empty air. The realization that we could not save them, nor ourselves, crushed our spirits. By dawn, only one of us remained. I stumbled out of the forest, barely able to comprehend what had happened. The sun's rays felt harsh and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive woods. I was physically free, but mentally, I knew I would never escape the horrors I had witnessed. The forest had claimed my friends and left me with a burden of guilt and terror that would haunt me forever. As I made my way back to civilization, I could only hope that my story would serve as a warning. Never take the forgotten path.